I'm trying to think of when it all started. I want to say it was only a few years ago, but it started right when I was born. There's always been something wrong with me. I was never fully present, never fully awake or in the moment. I was just always in my head, always thinking. They say you can accomplish anything you set your mind to, and that was the problem for me. I never could set my mind to anything, which is why I'm a failure. But just recently, I certainly set my mind to something. My life became increasingly hard to bear over the years. Each time I thought it couldn't get worse, it always got worse the year or so after. I thought I had hit rock bottom when I made an attempt on my life when I was 14. I was only at the beginning stages then. Things became even harder as I progressed into high school. It was right before my senior year, but I thought I had reached my limit. I did, honestly, even though it didn't stop there. The non-stop bullying and embarrassment, abuse and neglect at home, and lacking the ability to tolerate even a portion of it. It was early August of 2018 when I decided to lock myself in my bedroom, drink an entire bottle of Crown Royal, and keep a loaded shotgun to my side. I wanted to black out and hope to never wake up. My final wish was denied when I woke up to my mom on the phone with the police after my dad broke down my door, being a former police officer himself. It turned out I made some tearful goodbye calls to some good friends, even to a girl I had a crush on since elementary school. That was the one that called the police, Hannah Ross. I eventually tried to make it up to her, but found out that she only called the police so that way no one would blame her if I went through with taking my own life. The pain of knowing she didn't care was the last real thing I ever felt. But life went on. I don't even want to call it life after that point. Rather just a sick excuse for one. Things were awkward at school. Everyone was too scared to bully me or interact with me at all for that matter. Not to mention the girl that I longed to have a future with no longer had any respect for me. Not that she ever cared about me to begin with. It was after that incident that I couldn't feel anything, period. I couldn't feel even the slightest satisfaction. I would try to play every video game I owned and do everything in town that was supposed to be fun, but none of it did the trick. It's a mental condition called Anhedonia. It means the complete inability to feel any kind of pleasure. I deeply suffered from this condition. It was unbearable. I eventually got expelled from the school because I stopped talking entirely. I practically went mute. I stopped doing my classwork, and I wouldn't talk to my friends or my teachers. I wouldn't even look them in the eye. I already had a bit of a record, but that was the nail in the coffin for them. I did homeschooling ever since, and over time I got a job at the local grocery store. I hated that job, but it was better than listening to my parents argue at home all day. Sometimes people I knew from school would see me there. I would only speak to them if it was work-related. Anything else, I just ignored. I was glad I didn't have to deal with public school anymore, but still had to work with a manager that was a walking sack of shit. He had us refer to him by his last name, Martinez, even though everyone else went by their first names. All my life, no matter where I went or what I did, there was always someone pissing me off. Anyways, I think I remember when it started now, when I began to snap. I survived through another day of small town retail, aka hell on earth. I made a plan to hang out with my friend Brandon at his little brother's football game. I was about to clock out for the day when Martinez asked me, across the store, "Where are you going?" I didn't respond. Martinez then looked at the other employees as he mocked me. He's like, "Oh, I don't know." I clocked out and left the store. I walked home and attempted to walk straight into my room before my mom stopped me by saying loudly, "How was work?" Even though we were indoors. I said the usual, "It was good." "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing, I'm fine," I replied. "What's wrong with you?" she asked again. "Nothing, I'm fine," I said assertively. "Don't get mad at me," she said. "I'm not getting mad at you," I replied. There was a short pause before she asked, "Where are you going?" "I'm going to hang out with Brandon," I replied. "What are you guys gonna do?" she asked. "We're just gonna watch his brother's game and talk," I replied. There was then another pause before she went back to what she was doing. I changed into a black hoodie so no one would recognize me at the football game. I rode my bike down to Brandon's house. When I reached the intersection to his street, there was a road rager that sped up behind me and honked their horn, causing me to pedal too fast out of control and crash into the sidewalk near a fence. I heard the person in the car laughing when they rolled their windows down. I picked up my bike and walked down the street till I got to Brandon's. He was already outside sitting on the hood of his car. "What's up, man?" he asked. "Living the dream," I replied. "I miss seeing you, dude," he said. "I know. I'm sure it'll get better," I said while looking down. "All right, let's go," said Brandon. We began pedaling down the sidewalk toward the football field. I remember enjoying the feeling of riding your bike with your best friend, but all I felt was burning tension and paranoia. We arrived at the game, and I pulled my hood up to try and hide my face. Brandon and I sat on one of the top bleachers. We talked for a while, and then decided to go down to the concession stand. As we did, I noticed some of my former classmates looking at me and talking in each other's ears while laughing. My blood was already boiling. Brandon got a soda and a Butterfinger, while I just got a cup of hot coffee. We paid and then proceeded to the ramp toward the bleachers. As we passed the concession area, I noticed one of the science teachers from the school, Mr. Romero, was looking at me until he saw my face under my hood. Brandon and I continued up the ramp until Mr. Romero called out my last name. "Jones!" I tried to walk faster until he called out louder, "Jones! Travis Jones!" Brandon and I turned around. "You're expelled, Travis. You can't be here." "We're not at the school, though," I said back to him. "This is a school event. This is still property, and you're expelled. That doesn't mean just from the school building. That means school events, activities, everything," Romero said while stepping towards us. "He's with me, though. I brought him," said Brandon. Romero then raised his voice. "That doesn't cut it. No excuses. It's trespassing in the name of the school. Do you see what I'm saying? Your parents signed a form, Travis. Are we going to have to press charges on your mom and dad just because you can't stay off campus?" That was the last thing I heard before I started seeing red, and I took the lid off of my coffee cup and threw the cup into Mr. Romero's face as the coffee splashed all over him. I then walked past him before he tried to grab my right arm. I raised my left fist and punched Mr. Romero in the mouth. He fell to the ground and attempted to get up before I kicked him in the face, causing his nose to bleed. I then stormed out from the stadium and rode my bike all the way home. I threw my bike into the driveway and walked inside. My dad was already on the couch, scratching his head, when I walked into the living room. He shut off the TV and stood up from the couch, then pushed me down onto the floor. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted. "What the fuck am I doing wrong? You try to kill yourself over some dumb bitch that never talked to you? You go fucking mute at school so they expel you. Now you're attacking people at a football game? Are you crazy?" Your mom and I could lose our jobs because of you. He continued for about 5 more minutes until I tuned him out. I just couldn't get over how satisfying it was, throwing the hot coffee into that piece of shit's face, then knocking him on his ass. I had wished it wasn't at a public event. That way I could have done more. I wanted to do more. I wanted more. It felt good, hurting him, making him bleed, humiliating him in front of his little audience, and dealing massive damage to his self-image. Precisely what he does to students on a basis. I could have been beating his face in all night long. I eventually went back to bed after my dad finished his monologue, as well as my mom pitching in afterward. I'd write what all they said, but this pen only has so much ink. It basically concluded with the punishment of me not being able to hang out with Brandon anymore for the rest of the year, as well as not being able to leave the house unless it's for work. At least I still had my job. The next day, my dad dropped me off at the grocery store, and I walked over to clock in. Martinez came out from the office and said, rather loudly, "Good morning." I said back to him, "Good morning." "Good morning," he then said, mocking my voice. It was another day in paradise already. "How come you didn't empty the trash last night?" he asked. "I left early. I had somewhere to be," I answered. "Where'd you have to be?" he asked while laughing. "My friend's little brother had a football game," I answered. "So, your friend's little brother's football game?" he asked with a sarcastic tone. "Yes," I said. "The one you got kicked out of." There was a long pause before he continued, and my blood was already steaming. "Yeah, it's a small town, Travis. The word always gets out. So the first thing you can do is empty all the trash outside that you didn't do last night because of your, friend's little brother's football game." He walked down the aisle, and I went over to the stockroom to grab a roll of trash bags and headed toward the entrance. As I was walking down the aisle in front of the stockroom, an elderly man approached me and said, "Excuse me, where would I find the foot braces?" "Those are going to be on the back wall right here," I said. I then walked over to the elastic goods section and showed the man where the foot braces were. He asked me a few questions about the kind of foot braces he wanted for his leg and had trouble reading what was on the packaging. He eventually picked out a product he wanted. He thanked me and I walked back toward the entrance. Martinez walked by as I was headed that way and said, "Those trashes still aren't done. What are you doing?" he said with a big smile as well. "I was helping a customer," I said. "What customer?" he asked as there was no one in the aisle behind me. I turned around and was going to point over to where I helped the old man, but before I could say anything, Martinez said, "You should just do the trash," before laughing and walking away. I overheard him say, "I was helping a customer," while mimicking my voice. I finally made my way out to the front entrance so I could empty the outside trash cans. That's a basic summary of what my job was like overall. It was a long, miserable day as usual until it was time to close. Martinez told me I had to help him make a bale of cardboard boxes and move it to the back of the store outside. 2 of the other coworkers were around as we discussed it, and Martinez said, "We have to do work, Travis. You think you're up for it?" And they all laughed. I think it was then that I knew what I was about to do. Martinez and I went over to the stockroom and we started loading the baler with the cardboard boxes. I was already pissed, so I was basically throwing the boxes into the baler, quickly and furiously. "There you go, Travis, get mad. Get mad, Travis," Martinez said, then chuckled. I continued throwing in the boxes with aggression until Martinez called out, "Where's this shit when you're slacking all day?" I'm not exaggerating when I say that the second he said that was the second that I brought him to the ground and began rapidly bludgeoning his head with my fists. I recall him attempting to say my name as well as stop, but he couldn't get a full word out as I was landing blows. He reached up and tried to grab my face, but I grabbed his hand and bit off his middle and ring fingers. Martinez screamed in pain before I stood up and looked down on his bruised and almost toothless face. I raised up my foot and stomped on his head 3 times, knocking him out cold. I looked around, I paced, wondering what to do. I had the perfect idea for a cover-up. The first thing I did was empty out the cardboard from the baler. I took a large vodka bottle from the liquor stock and emptied some of it into the sink. I went over to Martinez and poured the rest of the bottle in his mouth. He was waking up and choking on the vodka. I picked him up on my shoulder as he wasn't the largest person, and I was fairly strong for my age. I threw him down into the baler, closed the gate, and turned it on. He fully woke up just in time to realize what was happening. He screamed in horror, which was really all he could do. His screams grew more animalistic as the compressor crushed down on him. Blood was squirting out from the bottom of the baler. The sound of his disembowelment was music to my ears. When the compressor was raised to the top, there was an eyeball and an intestine stuck on it, while blood was still leaking. I looked at the bottom of the baler to see the satisfying sight of Martinez's corpse. I can just remember the feeling of seeing a dead body for the first time. Knowing I caused it made it all the better. His ribs sticking out of his torso, his jaw pushing through the top of his crushed skull. It was all a work of art, and I needed more. Before I left, I went into the office and disabled all of the security cameras and cleared all of the footage. I also made sure to clean the blood off of my shoes. I grabbed my backpack and headed out to see my dad waiting for me in the parking lot. "What's wrong?" he asked as I got into the car. "Nothing," I said. "You've got a look on your face," he said concerningly. "I don't want to talk about it," I said. He let out a big sigh and said softly, "I'm your dad. There's nothing you can't tell me. You can trust me." I cleared my throat and took a deep breath. I was supposed to help my manager in the stockroom, but he sent me home because he said I was too lazy, even though I offered to help him. "The same one that's always mean to you?" asked my dad. I nodded my head. "People are jerks, Travis. It's got nothing to do with you and everything to do with them," he said. I remained silent while my dad still looked at me for a few seconds before starting up the car and heading home. I spent that whole night staring up at the wall thinking. I knew I had crossed the line, but I didn't cross it far enough. I needed more. I wish Martinez would have somehow survived so I could induce pain on him forever. I had to find a way, something. This was it. It was the only real joy I felt. The next morning, I woke up to my dad waking me, saying, "Travis, you need to get up and put some clothes on right now." I already knew what that meant. I got dressed and walked down the hallway to see both my parents sitting at the dining room table, accompanied by a police officer. "Good morning, I'm Officer France. Are you Travis?" the officer asked. Yeah, I said. "I'd like you to have a seat, son." I pulled a chair and sat down across from Officer France. "I understand you work at the local city market?" I nodded my head. "And you worked the closing shift last night, left around 10 o'clock? "Yes," I said. "Well, I've got some bad news for you, bud. I'm gonna need you to take a deep breath for me, okay? This morning we've made an unfortunate discovery. A body was found in the cardboard compressor identified to be Felipe Martinez." France locked eyes with me as he said this, visually documenting my every movement. I looked over to my parents and let out a little sigh of shock. as I said, "Oh my God." I covered my mouth with my hand because I thought it might look nice. "Now I understand you're in shock, but I'm gonna need you to answer some questions for me, okay?" I nodded my head and was able to force out a couple tears. I threw in the classic quivering lip. "So, would you say Martinez was an okay guy, got along with everyone well?" France asked, while still staring right into my pupils. "Not really. He was very rude and unkind toward his employees and customers. He was a very miserable person," I said, while making my voice sound shaky. "Gotcha, okay. Yeah, we heard a lot of that from the crew up at City Market. Said he wasn't the nicest guy, had a hard time cooperating. Some said he was an alcoholic as well?" France asked. "I'm pretty sure he was. I could sometimes smell it on him. And I rang him up a couple times when our vodka was on sale. He seemed to have a problem," I replied. "Okay, yeah, so the investigator said that he quite possibly was intoxicated at the time of his death and there was an empty bottle of vodka on the floor. Not only that, but the doors were unlocked all night. Looked like some items were stolen, stuff broken into. Reports of vandalism as well. We found some aisles knocked over and some 2-liter soda bottles splashed all over the place. It was a big mess," he stated. My eyes widened as I was legitimately surprised that the store was vandalized. "So we tried to pull up the surveillance footage, but the cameras were disabled. The whole thing was wiped. Would you know anything about that?" asked Officer France. I took a deep breath and answered, "Yeah, the cameras are supposed to always be on. I mean, they only reset them after a couple years or so from what I've heard." "Do you know how to reset the cameras?" "Have you ever had to do anything like that?" France asked. "No, I'm just on the floor most of the time. I never really go in the office," I replied. "Okay. So what about Martinez? Was that something he could do, resetting the cameras, wiping the footage?" he asked. "I honestly don't know. The only person I ever saw, on the cameras was the store manager," I answered. "Gotcha. Okay, so Martinez was an on-duty manager, but not the store owner?" France asked. "Yes," I said. "Alright, now tell me about the last time you saw him, last thing he said to you before you went home last night. Did he seem off to you at all? Anything unusual?" France asked me. "He was definitely more of a jerk than usual yesterday, especially right before I left. He said he needed some help filling up the compressor and making a bale to wheel it outside. There were 2 other employees that just went home, so I offered to help him out, but he didn't accept it, I guess. He said I was just gonna slack off, so he just wanted to do it himself," I responded. "Okay, so it's looking a lot like he was back there with the compressor and saw the liquor bottles on the shelves. He was by himself, thought he'd screw around, goes back and clears the cameras, drinks a little, drinks a lot, blacks out, breaks a bunch of store merchandise, knocks over the aisles, just has a big freak out, goes back and throws all the cardboard out of the compressor, gets inside, turns it on, and kills himself. I mean, from everything we've gathered, the guy seems like a pretty unstable person altogether. We checked his background. It looks like he's the last member of his family, not married, no kids. So he has too much to drink and takes his own life. That's what we'll be writing up unless the autopsy report points out something else," said Officer France. "This is unbelievable," my mom called out. "Yeah, I've been on the force about 8 years now and I've never seen anything like this," France added. "I've seen about 3 suicides in my years working for the sheriff's office, but nothing like this," said my dad. That was when France's radio was going off and he had to leave. "Well, thank you for your time. I appreciate you speaking with me. I'll go ahead and get out of your hair. If anything else comes up in that autopsy report, I'll give you a call," France said. "Of course, anytime," my dad replied. I couldn't believe it. I did it. I just barely got away with murder, clearing the cameras, pouring the bottle. It all played out. Thank God the doors were unlocked. The thieves that came in covered it up even better. Those nice thugs did me a solid. It was all pure luck, and the risk could not have been higher. The real question was, who's next? The grocery store closed down for a few days after the incident, so I had some time off. I spent most of that time sleeping. I waited until everyone went to bed so I could take a late-night walk to refresh myself. I unlocked my window and stepped out at around 1 in the morning. I took my usual route around my neighborhood at a slow pace, It was nice having a thing to do where nobody bothers you. That was the idea. I stood corrected when some idiots in a cheap pickup truck drove by and honked at me as I crossed from one street to another. They were clearly speeding, and I wasn't in any collision distance when I crossed. Some people just like to honk for the sake of honking. I kept walking on the sidewalk of the street I crossed onto, and I saw the same truck come back around, and as they passed me, one of them threw an empty beer bottle that hit me in the head. They all roared with laughter as it hit me. I quickly picked up a rock and threw it at the truck as they drove off, and broke their left taillight. They slammed their brakes, and all three of them got out. There was the ringleader, the fat one, and the scrawny one. They all approached me with intent to attack me. "You just throw a rock, you little fuck? Come on, let's beat his fucking ass," the ringleader called out. I turned and sprinted the other direction. They all got back in the truck and stepped on the gas, chasing after me. I made it to the neighborhood cemetery and jumped the fence. They parked the truck right by the fence and jumped it right after me. I kept running into the cemetery until I tripped on a gravestone. They caught up to me by the time I got up. The three of them got the best of me as they pushed me to the ground and were punching and kicking me all over. Each time I tried to get up, I would get knocked down harder. I was losing consciousness as the tips of their boots landed in my stomach and my head. The ringleader picked up the rock that I threw and pressed his knee on my chest. "You like throwing rocks, bitch? Huh?" He then struck me across the head with the rock. The ringleader stood up as the scrawny one ran up and started hitting me with an aluminum baseball bat. I rolled over on my stomach as he continuously was hitting my back with the bat. As quickly as I could, I grabbed his foot and bit out his Achilles tendon. He screamed like the weasel he was. The screaming stopped when I picked up the bat and swung downward on his head, knocking him down. The fat one charged me, but lost his wind when I swung the bat into his mouth. Finally, the ringleader stepped back and got onto his knees. "Hey, all right, I'm sorry, please let me go. Please don't kill me," he pleaded. I swung the bat into the center of his face, breaking his nose. The ringleader fell back crying. All three of them were laying in the grass, groaning in pain by the gravestones that they were about to join. I stood over the fat one and raised the bat in the air before bashing his cranium into the soil. All it took was 4 good hits, and his chubby head was gone. The scrawny one attempted to stand up on his only working foot. I threw him on his back and kneeled down over him. I pressed the aluminum bat against his neck with both my hands, harder than I knew I could. The skinny bastard choked and gagged until his windpipe snapped. The ringleader was crawling away, pleading for help in the dark cemetery, where no one could hear him. I dropped the bat and picked up the rock. I walked up to the ringleader and kicked his face about 6 or 7 times. I picked up the rock and shoved it in his mouth. I rolled him over onto the ground as his head was held up on the grass by the rock in his mouth. There was a large stone coffin right by him. I got on top of the coffin and jumped off, landing on the ringleader's head with both my feet, stomping his head into the rock. I rolled him on his back to see that his mouth was ripped open and his frontal teeth were pushed up into his gums. The ringleader attempted to scream as he was gagging on blood. I kneeled down over him with all my might and then some. I pressed my thumbs into his eye sockets. His arms flailing and his legs kicking as I kept pressing until blood erupted from his sockets all over my hands. I searched his pockets and found the keys for the truck. One by one, I picked up all 3 corpses and threw them over the fence and into the back seat of the truck. I got inside the truck and shut the door. As I did, a police car was passing by with its searchlight on. I ducked down in the seat before they could see me. There were other cars parked on the side road of the cemetery as well. Thank God. The police car drove out of sight. I started up the truck and slowly drove back toward my house with my headlights off. I parked in the long alleyway between the backyards of the houses on my street. I jumped my backyard fence and crawled through the window to my room. I opened my desk drawer and grabbed my 2 canisters of Zippo lighter fuel and one of my big lighters. I crawled back through the window and shut it. I jumped back over the backyard fence and got into the truck. I drove along the highway that was right by my house until I was far enough out. I drove off the road and rammed through the desert fence, then continued driving far out into the vast field until the town was out of sight. I poured out both canisters of lighter fuel all over the outside of the truck, as well as the interior. I ignited the truck with the lighter and shut the driver door. I stepped back as the truck was burning. I sprinted back home as quickly as I could. When I crawled back through my window, I changed into my pajamas and hid my clothes under my bed. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I enjoyed the view outside the kitchen window as the sun was rising. That was one of the greatest nights of my life. I could relive it forever. The look of hopelessness in that stick figure's eyes when I strangled him with the bat. The satisfaction was to kill for, and quite literally at that. Something did have to change though. I needed weapons. I couldn't just use my hands. The baseball bat was good, but not in groups. I needed something quicker. I left the bat in the burning truck anyways. I loved the repetition with the bat, prolonging the pain with a dull end. But I needed something sharp, something that will draw more blood. Impalement gives more of a scream than a bludgeoning. It's not just a bruise, but penetration through the nerves. More blood, more screaming, more pain. The body was made to suffer in so many ways one could only imagine. At this moment now as I'm writing this, I no longer need to imagine. I woke up in the afternoon. I was surprised to see that I could actually get up and go to the kitchen to make cereal without any dramatic commotion. My parents kept to themselves, and my brother was in his room. Nothing was suspected. The fact that I took 3 lives within 12 hours prior to waking up was nothing but a whisper in the wind. The whole ordeal went almost completely unnoticed until I saw that the fence was already being repaired from when my dad and I drove by it on our way to run errands. I wondered if they'd search any further beyond repairing a broken fence. I drove at least 10 miles out before I set the truck on fire. They'd have to be pretty dedicated to the cause to find a burnt truck with 3 corpses in the middle of nowhere. That Officer France guy didn't seem dedicated to any cause, much like a majority of the residents in that garbage little town. As we came to a red light on our way downtown, there was a troublesome-looking group of young men, dressed all black with their white sneakers. 5 of them, 2 I recognized from school, and the other 3 were probably in their early 20s, still acting half their age. I'm sure they had names, but they weren't putting them to any use, so I'll address them by their hairstyles. Man bun, comb over, broccoli head, cornrows, and dreadlocks. They flipped off my dad and I before they crossed the street. My dad honked at them, and they all 5 jumped up and down with laughter, like the monkeys they were, while throwing up gang signs of turfs that weren't even a 3-hour plane flight from where we were. Fatherless behavior, said my dad. I nodded my head. We parked on the street and went into an antique store. My dad was looking for something to send to my grandfather who was terminally ill. You can look around if you want, my dad said to me. I wandered around the store. There wasn't anything really interesting in the shop. Not that I could feel interest to begin with. I looked in this cornered section where there was a pretty off-putting portrait of a Native American with red face paint. On the shelf next to the portrait was a marionette clown puppet. It seemed to be the antiques that no sane person would want section, which must be why there was one thing that really caught my eye. It was a mask. Not even a mask, it was a whole new face. It looked like it was supposed to replicate a plastic doll. The hair was really smooth and shiny. The face was very childlike, while still completely emotionless. I grabbed it and picked it up. I swear I could faintly see a slight twinkle in the eye holes of the mask. I then put it on and looked at my reflection in the glass of the Native American portrait. It had full expression. Whatever my face did, the mask did. Movement of the mouth, raising of the eyebrows. Even when I would blink, it would slightly move. I could see crystal clear in it and breathe perfectly normal. And best of all, there was no way to recognize me. As I was admiring the mask, the Native American portrait in the window was somehow looking at me. The clown puppet was facing me as well. "If you're gonna put that on, you have to pay for it," the cashier lady called out. I turned to face her. When my eyes met hers through the mask, she froze, her eyes widened, and pupils slowly dilated. "Never mind, you can take it," she said, shakingly. "What's going on?" my dad called out. I took off the mask. My dad made his way over and saw the mask in my hand. "Travis, don't touch anything," he said. "No, it's fine. Take it. It's yours," said the cashier before she walked away rather quickly. "What is it?" asked my dad. I held it up and showed it to him. "And just why is that something that somebody would want?" "I don't know. It's just, I like it," I replied. My dad looked at me, then the mask, then back at me, before shaking his head and walking away. My dad did buy something from that store. I couldn't remember what it was. I didn't see the point anyways. My grandfather was dying, not going away for a while, dying. I still felt nothing. I couldn't feel for the loss of anybody. It could have been anyone. The entire planet could explode and I wouldn't feel a thing. Unless, of course, I could be the one to destroy it. My dad and I got back into the car and drove off from the street parking and down a couple blocks to the sporting goods store. We saw the group of gangster wannabes coming out of an alley as we came to an intersection. I put the mask on and looked out the window at one of them. None of them noticed me except for Cornrows. When he saw me in the mask, the whole degenerate tough guy persona was gone, and he froze into a look of terror. "Take that off. What the hell's wrong with you?" said my dad. I took the mask off and set it on the seat after we parked at the sporting goods store. There was a police car parked out front as well. I kept my guard up. When we walked through the automatic doors, we saw that Officer France was standing at the counter talking to the clerk. "Of course," I mumbled under my breath. I followed my dad over to the carrier section. I looked behind the counter at all the firearms displayed on the wall. There was one I really liked. It was a Mossberg pump action with a vented barrel and a dark nickel-plated finish. I walked over to it and tried to see the price on it. When I walked over to it, I also noticed a large Taurus revolver displayed in the glass case below the counter. It was a Model 627. The barrel was about 6 inches long, and the cylinder could hold 7 rounds. It was perfect, and it matched the Mossberg with its finish. I like silver-colored guns because of how they look when their shiny surface gets stained with blood. On that note, there was a separate room in the store where they displayed all of the knives, hatchets, and such. I entered the room and was in search of a weapon to my liking. There were a plethora of knives and tomahawks that looked promising. What took my breath was this large Bowie knife with a stainless steel blade and a black handle. The front was razor sharp with a curve at the top, and the back was serrated and jagged like a shark's mouth. It was in its own display box on the counter, aside from the other blades, which I thought was odd, not to mention a pair of large black gloves that were lying by the box. There wasn't even a lock on the case. I could just open it up. I took it out of the case and held it. My hand gripped perfectly onto the handle. I was ready right then and there. I was tempted to get started on one of the employees, but obviously I couldn't just yet. I took the Bowie knife and put it in the sheath that it came with. I then hid it in the inside pocket of my hoodie. I walked back out to see that my dad had picked out a carrier for his hunting rifle, and also grabbed a pack of earplugs. We proceeded to the checkout to see that Officer France was still speaking with the clerk. The clerk noticed us and walked over to check us out. When France saw us, he said, "How you guys doing?" "Not too bad, just getting ready for the season," my dad said. "Right on, I'll try to get one myself if we can close all these cases in time," said France. The clerk jumped in. "Absolutely, no doubt you'll get them. Whoever these punks are, they're in the wrong town." France then nodded while looking right at me as he said, "We're definitely getting closer to catching them." It made me question if I covered up everything or not. I wondered what they could have found out. The clerk gave my dad his receipt, and we were on our way out. France came out behind us. "Hey, you got a second, Mr. Jones?" he said. We both turned around. "Of course. What's up?" asked my dad. "I was meaning to give you a call and take another statement from your son. We have some further questions if that's all right with you," said France. "Sure, come by at around 3:30 and we'll be ready for you," my dad replied. It was pretty typical for him to set me up to be questioned, without even asking if I was okay with it. That's all being a kid really is. I sat down in the passenger seat of the car as my dad set the rifle carrier in the trunk. The quote-unquote bad boys were still wandering around the area in their desperate hopes to receive the attention they lacked at their single-parent households. I guess that was their turf. I reached into my hoodie to grip the handle of the Bowie knife as I glared at all the smelly lowlifes. I couldn't wait. My dad got in the car and let out a sigh as he started up the car. He was likely stressed over getting the house ready for Officer France, as was I. We made our way home, and I went into my room to hide the knife in my closet. I then went into the bathroom and shut the door. I put on my new mask and couldn't take my eyes off myself in the mirror. The mask was like a new layer of skin. It was the only face I wanted. The one I had, I put to waste. My mom knocked on the bathroom door. "Travis, the police are here," she called out. "On my way," I said. I took off the mask and set it on my bed before heading down the hallway into the dining room to see that this time there were two officers, France and someone else, a larger officer that was laser focused onto me. They both were. "Good afternoon, Travis. This is Lieutenant Stokes." I looked over at the lieutenant. He remained still, as did I. France continued. "Why don't you have a seat, bud?" I pulled out a chair and sat down next to my dad and across the two officers. France took a deep breath before speaking. "They wrapped up the autopsy report on Felipe Martinez's body. It wasn't a suicide, he was murdered." My dad sighed. I did as well, trying to match his reaction. Stokes noticed as I did that. "Well, what happened?" asked my dad. "He was crushed really badly, but there was just enough of his head left to see that he had bruises on his face with fingerprints that were not his own, as well as the small teeth marks on his hand. Somebody brutally assaulted him and bit off 2 of his fingers," France explained. "Christ," said my dad. I let out a heavy sigh, which was good for the act, but was a real sigh regardless. The results also pointed out that he wasn't intoxicated at the time of death. The alcohol wasn't fully processed until after his body was found. Somebody forcefully poured the bottle of vodka down his throat, quite possibly to cover their tracks. Another thing we found out is that there was no way he could have turned on the cardboard compressor while he was inside it. You see, the gate was closed shut, and that can only be done on the outside of the compressor," France explained.
So somebody beat him up, bit off his fingers, then threw him into that thing and crushed him? That's correct. Now, we aren't entirely sure that this was done by just one person. I doubt just one individual could pick him up and throw him in the compressor, said France. So we're dealing with a group of psychos, said my dad. Very disturbed individuals, to say the least, said France. He looked over at me as he said that. Stokes was still glaring at me. My mom noticed Stokes was onto me, but said nothing. France cleared his throat and took a deep breath. All right, Travis, so the day prior to Martinez's murder, you crossed school property and assaulted one of your old teachers, Mr. Romero? He asked. I nodded my head. And this was someone you had a problem with, so when he called you out, you just weren't having it? I nodded my head again. Okay, now we've gathered some additional details, and it sounds like you and Martinez had some bad blood as well? France asked me. I mean, no one liked the guy. He had bad blood with everyone, I answered. Right, said France. There was a pause after that. No one said anything. Everyone in that room knew what was happening. Lieutenant Stokes finally started speaking. Travis, you were the last person that was with Felipe Martinez before whatever happened. You already had beef with the guy, you already assaulted a teacher you had beef with the night before. Not the week, not the month, the night before. I nodded my head. Stokes continued. Now you do understand that no matter what you tell us, we will find out what happened. And the best thing you can do for your situation is be 100% honest. I nodded my head again. Stokes leaned forward and set his elbows on the table before asking. I'm going to ask you this once and once only. Travis Jones, did you have anything to do with the murder of Felipe Martinez? I took a few seconds to calculate my response in my head until I answered. No. Stokes and France both sighed. They looked at each other, then back at me. I'm sorry, are you accusing my son? My mom asked. Man, we're keeping all possibilities open. It's life and death, said France. My son is not a killer, my dad shouted. That isn't what we're implying. There was likely multiple attackers, said France. Well, my son isn't one of them, my dad said angrily. It was then that both the officers' radios went off. It was something about two suspects breaking into an elderly woman's house on a different side of town. They both quickly had to leave. I could hear their loud siren as they pulled out from our driveway. My dad closed the door behind them and walked back into the living room and sat down across the chair from where I was sitting. Travis, please tell me you didn't kill that guy, he said, shakingly. I didn't, I said. I was surprised he suspected me, being my father. Truth be told, he had every right to. He used to be a cop himself, and I wasn't innocent. I did it. I killed him. I would not admit it just yet. I needed to kill more. I had only just begun. I had only just gotten my new face. It wasn't over, but I needed to cause an illusion. At that time, I had only killed 4, but I needed to take a break. The 2 delinquents would eventually be caught. It turned out that they murdered the old woman by beating her to death. That was when I stopped for a good while. The police connected the dots when the far more grisly murders came to a pause. That lasted about a month and a half before I couldn't wait any longer. I had to kill again. It was the middle of December. We got nearly 2 feet of snow that year. All the Christmas lights and decorations were so illuminating and bright. I wished that I could burn all of them down. I was finally driving after I got my license. I had an old 2001 Dodge Dakota. I was still working at the grocery store, even during Christmas break. I know, I'm surprised they didn't fire me by then. There was a new shift leader named Keith. He was an okay guy. Hell of a lot better than the burro he replaced. It was around noon when I overheard a commotion that Keith was trying to de-escalate. I heard a familiar voice raising hell over some Hallmark products not being in stock. I walked past the gifting aisle to see that Mr. Romero from the high school was complaining to Keith about the gift bags not being in stock. There was a deal where you could buy 10 of the bags for under $5. You guys are supposed to make sure that you're stocking this aisle every day, twice a day, Mr. Romero said with his prissy attitude. I apologize for the inconvenience, but the Hallmark vendors have already stocked this aisle for the week. You're gonna have to wait. If you'd like, I could give you a rain check, Keith said, in a failed attempt to lower the tension scale. Yeah, nice try. Like there would be a rain check for a holiday item. Nice try, buddy, said Mr. Romero before he looked over and noticed I was at the end of the aisle. Are you supposed to be stocking this aisle, Travis? He said to me. I didn't respond. I stared him down, looking directly into his fragile soul from the distance we were standing. I'm sure he had more up his sleeve, but it didn't matter. He saw me. It was almost like he knew at that moment what I had already done and was going to do. I knew it at that moment as well. I couldn't last without blood. It was time. I clocked out for the day by 4 p.m. and headed to the sporting goods store first thing. The Mossberg shotgun that I liked was still there in the same spot. It was $574.99. I had enough savings to cover that. I told the clerk that I wanted it, and he carded me first thing. Not that I blame him. The state law was that you had to be at least 18 years old and possess a valid driver's license to purchase a shotgun. Check and check. There was some paperwork I signed and other bullshit, but it was finally mine. I also made sure to buy a few boxes of 12-gauge shells. It was given to me in a cardboard box, which I hid under the back seat of my Dodge. As I drove from the sporting goods parking lot, I passed the antique store and saw a really dark black leather jacket on display through the window. That could definitely help me be harder to see at night. I pulled over and parked on the street. I walked into the antique store and asked how much the jacket was. The cashier told me that she could make a bargain for $50. I lowered that to $35 and made the purchase. Keep in mind that this was the same cashier that saw me put the mask on. When I got back home, I went into my room after the usual default dialogue with my parents. I hid my jacket in the truck as well, because I knew they would question me on it. Usually when I bought anything or did anything that I felt confident about, my parents would find some way to criticize it. I spent a few hours doing my online homeschool assignments and tried to get a few hours of shut-eye, as I had a big night ahead of me. I set my alarm to vibrate only, that way no one else wakes up. It went off at 1:30 a.m. I was ready. I crawled out the window to the backyard and jumped the fence. I made sure to grab my mask. Thankfully, the snow service trucks already cleared the roads. I drove to the downtown area, hoping to see those thugs that would roam around there. It was probably past their curfew. I was sure someone would turn up. Surely enough, someone did. Red and blue lights started flashing from behind me out of nowhere. I pulled to the side of the road and parked. I pulled out my license as the officer approached me and knocked on the windshield, revealing it to be Officer France. I rolled my window down and handed him my license. What are you doing driving around so late? He asked. Driving around for no fucking reason at 1 in the morning is some of the only peace and quiet I can get. I'm stuck in that fucking room all day with nothing to do, and my parents can't even look at me anymore without questioning my every movement. So yeah, here I am, go ahead, arrest me. Might as well make shit interesting. My life is already fucked, I said, almost shouting. I'm not gonna arrest you, buddy, but I'm gonna need you to calm down and watch your mouth, pal, France said to me. I looked away and nodded my head. Just sit tight, I'm gonna go scan this out, he said. When he turned his back, I quickly pulled out the Mossberg and shot Officer France in the back. He collapsed to the ground. I put my mask on and pulled out my knife. I got out and walked over while pumping another shell in the chamber. He was trying to reach for his radio, but was paralyzed. I stood over him as he looked up at me trying to speak. When he saw me in my mask, it was almost like he gave up right then. I kneeled down over him and sawed into his neck with the Bowie knife.
He spit out about a liter of blood before I got past the windpipe. The knife was so sharp, it barely took any effort to cut through the bone. I carved the letters O-I-N-K into his forehead and set the head on the driver's seat of the police car for the other pork chops to find. I made sure to grab his handgun and his spare magazines before I left him there. One down. It was a productive night already. I got back into my truck and took off down the main road. There were two cars traveling close together in the right lane. I pulled up in front of them to make it look like we were all together. As the three police cars were rushing down the other side of the road with their sirens on. It was probably time to head back after that. I turned my headlights all the way off and drove back home. When I made it back through the window into my room, I saw that I had gotten a text message from an unknown number saying, "Nice one. Fucker didn't know it hit him." I could smell the cooked bacon from all the way over here. I was completely frozen. I wrote back, "Who is this? Relax, we aren't gonna hurt you. We've been watching you for a while. We like how you operate, and the mask is a great touch. It's about time we reached out. So, do you like guns?" They replied. I stood there for a second, wondering what to say, until I wrote back, "Love them." They replied saying, "Good. We'll work out a surprise for you tomorrow night. For right now, make your way to Washington Park." I wrote back, "How do I know this isn't a sting?" They answered saying, "Would a cop send you this?" There was a video attached to the message. I plugged in my headphones and played the video. It was of a young girl who was blindfolded and had no clothes on. Her cleavage seemed to be freshly severed off, as well as both of her arms. She was chained into a table, with a wood-cutting saw at the end of it in between her legs. The chains around her legs were being slowly pulled, causing her to move down the table and into the woodcutter. She didn't appear to be fully conscious. She was barely able to groan as the saw cut into her groin and then into her stomach. I sent a message saying, "Nice. Alright, I'm sold. Washington Park it is." I grabbed my jacket, knife, and my face. I made my way to the park. I couldn't help but wonder who this person, or people, were. They definitely knew what they were talking about. It was all a blessing. The fact that I could inflict all the pain I wanted on others and be monitored by a professional in the process. I finally made it to the park after driving slowly through the neighborhood with my lights off. I noticed a group of people that looked to be smoking a bong on one of the tables at the park. I counted 7 of them. The 5 greasers from before, and a couple tramps that tagged along. I drove out of sight and parked up the street near the park, before I got out with the Glock that I got off of France. I thought about sneaking up on them, but they weren't worth the consideration. I just approached them head on. Man Bun was the first to notice me. They were all panicking, attempting to disguise it in laughter, until they saw my face. My new face. Silent. All of them. Silent. I raised my gun and fired twice into Comb-Over's chest. They all claymored in fear and panic. Dreadlocks lunged after me and shuffled in attempt to dodge another bullet. I drove my Bowie knife into his stomach, pushed the blade upward into him, then sawed backwards until the serrated end of the knife severed through the center of his ribcage and back through the skin, cutting through some intestines that were caught on the blade. Broccoli Head and Man Bun tried to get a hold of me from behind before I turned around, slashed Broccoli Head's neck, and shot Man Bun in the head. It was just cornrows and the 2 whores. The blonde cock tease was already getting her phone out and running away. I shot at her 3 times. She was hit once in the stomach and collapsed in the snow. I chased after Cornrow's full speed and jammed my knife through his back. I pulled out the knife, and he fell to the ground, sobbing hysterically. The other slut was nearly fainting due to shock. It wasn't hard to tackle her to the ground. I took my mask off, pressed myself onto her, and bit into the skin around her mouth. She screamed beautifully as I continually bit into her face. She tasted so raw and juicy. I pulled her jaws open until they ripped. That was when I chomped out her tongue. The fresh blood from her mouth was the most refreshing beverage I could ask for. She screamed long and loud. Her lower jaw was dangling, and her bitten tongue didn't seem to run out of blood. The snow was red. I put my mask back on. I dragged the little brat by her leg to where Cornrows was. He was still writhing and groaning from the wound through his back. I kneeled over him. I pulled up his shirt to see the exit wound on his belly. I pressed my fingers into the wound and ripped him open. I'm sure he would have screamed if he could, but all he could get out were these little high-pitched squeals. The snow around him soaked and red. You could see the steam coming from the wound, as it was not even 10 degrees outside. I grabbed the faceless slut by the neck and threw her face down, or I guess skull down, into the open torso of Cornrows. I pressed her head in with my boot, her arms flailing, legs kicking, drowning in blood and entrails, until the little whore passed from my hell to another. The only one still alive was the blonde girl. She was still breathing and had a steady pulse. I had big plans for little Goldilocks. I picked her up and carried her on my shoulders back to my truck. The anonymous number messaged me. "Very well done. Just so you know, we can only hack the police transmissions for so long. Do what you need to do with the girl, then waste her before the pigs show up." I wrote back with the letter K. I threw her in the backseat of the truck. I drove close to the sidewalk just in case any cops would pass me. I parked when it got close enough to the perfect place to do it. I threw the pretty Jezebel over my shoulders and carried her into the cemetery. I found a good spot in between two stone coffins that was mostly grass and no snow. I took everything off of her and everything off of me, except for my face. I ravaged every hole in her body, including the ones I cut into her. She was just conscious enough to feel it all, especially when I chewed on her soft labia. Her bleeding clitoris made it all the sweeter when I finished inside of her. She used all the life she had left to let out a pitiful scream. It was a shame. She was so lean, so soft and innocent. I wish she put up more of a fight. 7 mutilated corpses in Washington Park, 1 headless cop. That night was by far one of my best. When I got home, I thought it would be best to hide my weapons under my bed. That way if the police get a warrant in my truck, they won't find anything in there while I'm asleep. I wouldn't even need my truck for much longer. The unknown number was serious about the surprise they had for me. I got through the day with a tuned out 9 to 5 at work, and coming home to my dad informing me that Officer France was murdered. He didn't say anything about the 7 potheads in the park. Perhaps their bodies were snowed over and wouldn't be discovered just yet. "Oh my gosh, that's terrible," I said to my dad. He stopped speaking to me for the rest of the day. I think he was onto me. He knew that France was right to question me after I killed Martinez. It didn't matter, not one bit. Travis Jones was long gone by then. His body was just being used by something else. By an entity. By me. How can you pursue a walking corpse How can you patronize a lifeless being? Even if I were to be caught, it wouldn't change who I am. That night, I woke up at midnight to get a good head start. The unknown number messaged me within 10 minutes of me waking up. Ready to really get started? They said. You know it, I replied. They wrote back with an address to a storage unit in the far northern side of town. The unit they provided was number 18, and the code was 2340A. I started my engine and headed that way. There was a gate at the front entrance. It opened as soon as I pulled up to it. I drove down the aisle of units until I reached number 18 at the far end of the left aisle. I parked and stepped out while looking over my shoulder. I entered the code in the door, and the garage door to the unit opened. It was then that I got a message from the anonymous person saying, "Park your Dodge next to the black car inside." So I did just that. Another message appeared, telling me to close the unit door. So I did. The light then came on in the unit. Next to my truck was a large black SUV. The windows were so dark, you couldn't see the inside of them. There was a silver table next to it, where there was a ring of keys. The car unlocked when I pressed the button. It was Christmas already for me. I sent a message to the person saying, "Is this mine?" "That's your new ride. Now check the trunk," they replied. I opened the trunk of the SUV, and there was what looked to be a large gun case. I opened it up to see an AK-47 with a polished, jet black paint job. Underneath it was the Taurus revolver that I liked from the sporting goods store. I held the revolver in my hand. It was just as I imagined. I picked up the AK. It had some weight to it. The iron sight was clean. I loved how dark it was. I couldn't wait to find a big crowd that I could massacre. I then stepped into the driver's seat of the SUV and turned it on. There was exactly a lever. There was a lever under the radio controls. I knew exactly what it was. I pushed the lever, and red and blue lights started flashing all around the car. It was a fake police car. I could pull people over in the middle of the night. The unknown number messaged me saying, "It's all yours if you can answer me one question." I was eager to know what they wanted to ask. I wrote back, "Go ahead." They replied in a long message. "We are not a company. We are not a cult. We are ordinary people with a common desire: blood. Joining us is one of the only opportunities to live a life doing whatever you want without consequence. If you proceed any further, there is no going back. If you want to go back to your normal life, then you need to turn back right now, and we will stay away from you. But if you take this car and these guns, you're gone. Your mom and dad, your brother, everything, gone. I need to make that crystal clear. So the question is, are you ready?" I was far from gone in that current condition. Anhedonia had consumed me. Killing and slaughtering was the only joy I could get out of my cruel joke of a life. I wrote back, "I'm ready." They then sent an address to a building that was 45 minutes from where I was. I geared up and headed that way down the highway while maintaining my speed. The road was quiet. There was no one else but me the whole way down. I arrived at the house listed in the address. It was a distant farmhouse. There were a couple lowriders parked on the driveway and a Chevy pickup. There were colorful lights inside the house and loud booming music. I knew I was in the right place. I received a message from the unknown person upon arriving. There are 10 lives in that building that will not be missed. These bozos may as well turn themselves in if they even think about calling the cops. It's too far out for the locals to hear any gunshots, and there is a broken window in the garage. Do with that information what you will, but pace yourself. You don't want to take them all at once. I put my mask on and stepped out of the car with my shotgun strapped to my back. I snuck around the house to the garage building. I broke the rest of the window with the stock of my shotgun, then vaulted over. I was inside the garage. The lights were off. The music was too loud for me to be heard. The garage was full of used bongs and empty Modelo bottles. I slowly approached the door into the house and opened it. The house was covered in LED lights, flickering and changing colors. The loud music was in Spanish. I stepped out into the hallway. There was a living room a couple rooms down that most of them seemed to be in. I only heard male voices. I walked the other way to a door at the end of the hall that had its lights on. I pulled out my knife and barged in to see 3 tatted up Hispanic men playing poker on a small table. They all looked at me in confusion. I slammed the door shut and lunged across the room, slicing through the neck of the one on the left side of the table. The other 2 tried to get up. I quickly stabbed the one on the right in his chest. The one in the middle across the table from me was panicking. I threw the table over and headbutted him before throwing him down to the ground and rapidly stabbing him in the torso. He spit up blood for a good 10 seconds as I was impaling him before he couldn't breathe any longer. I stopped stabbing him and left him to suffocate. I opened the door and closed it as it was. To the right of the hallway was a staircase to the next floor. I snuck up the staircase with my shotgun ready. There was one room that looked to be lit up with LED lights as well from the inside. I heard loud gunshot noises coming from a speaker inside. Perfect. I decided to take a more polite approach to this room. I turned the knob and slowly opened the door, just a crack to look inside. 2 more inked-up druggies that looked a little younger than the last 3 were both looking at the TV with controllers in their hands. They both noticed the door opening. I stuck my hand through the door and gave a hand signal for them to come out as I said, "Hey, over here, vamonos." I still left the door open a crack. They both looked at each other, and one of them quickly got up and walked over. Right as he put his hand on the knob, I barged in and pushed him to the ground. I shut the door behind me and held them both hostage with the shotgun. "Put your hands behind your back and get on the ground," I said. They both followed orders. "You seem like good kids, respectful, obedient. I see a bright future ahead of you. A bright red one." I shot both of them in the heads with the shotgun. The virtual gunshots coming from the max volume speaker were louder than the real ones. I closed the door to that room behind me before I walked up to the room across from it. This room was lit up in pink. I slowly cracked open the door to see another vato with no clothes on in bed with a girl that didn't look a day over 12. He was sodomizing her, and his back was towards me. He was too high and too stimulated to notice my presence. That changed when I pulled him out of the child and severed off his genitalia with the Bowie knife. He fell to the ground, screaming and sobbing. That was all the torment he needed, yet I continued. I grabbed his right hand and cut it off with one clean slash. He squeaked like the disease-ridden rodent he was. The process was repeated for his left hand, and in one swing as well. I couldn't believe how sharp the Bowie knife was. The kid fiddling rat was out cold from shock. I left him there to rot. I turned around to face the kid in bed. Poor thing was tied up and drugged. I cut her bindings off and told her to stay put. I'm sure you're probably wondering why I didn't kill her too. When that happens to a child, there's no more pain that can be shown. It wasn't in me to hurt her. She was already done for. I walked out of the bedroom and into the hallway, then down the staircase. The person told me there were 10 of them. I killed 6. The other 4 were certain to be the ones partying in the living room. I didn't care to be sneaky at that point. I walked into the living room and opened fire with the Glock. 3 of them were down, and 1 made a run for it out the front door. He ran down the road. I let him get a good head start before I got in my new ride and chased after him. I turned on the red and blue lights as I pulled up to where he was. He got onto his knees and held his hands above his head. This wasn't his first rodeo, but it sure was his last. I pulled out my revolver and stepped out of the car. I slowly walked over to him. He was pointing toward the direction of the house in the distance, while repeating the words, "Please help me." He stopped panicking and froze when I got within a few feet from him. As he looked into my eyes through the mask, he knew it was over. I held the revolver up to the center of his face, in between his eyes, and pulled the trigger. I drove back to the house and went upstairs to where the girl was. She wasn't conscious. I shook her until her eyes opened. "Hey, wake up. Can you hear me?" I said to her. I took my mask off. She looked up at me with her bloodshot eyes. "Get up," I said. I pulled her up, and she stood up from the bed and walked with me. She had no reaction to the bloody corpses all over the house. They completely poisoned her. When we got to the car, I picked her up and set her in the passenger seat and adjusted the seatbelt onto her. I drove to the nearest hospital and took her into the emergency room. I held her hand as I walked in. The person behind the plastic window at the front desk asked, "How can I help you?" I looked her dead in the eyes as I said, "This little girl was drugged and raped. You need to help her and get her back to her parents." She looked at me for a couple seconds and asked, "What about you? You're covered in blood." "Not mine," I said to her. She continued questioning me. "Are you her guardian? Are you her father? Her brother?" I pulled open my jacket, revealing my revolver before saying, "Let's try that again. You are going to help this kid. You are going to return her to her parents. Have I made myself clear?" The lady behind the desk trembled and said, "Of course, right away, sir." I quickly sat down the little girl on one of the waiting chairs before exiting the hospital and taking off in my car down the highway to my hometown. I couldn't hurt a child. It's not in me. Filthy sluts and greasy faggots I could slaughter endlessly, but children are off limits. I arrived back at the storage unit. I checked my phone to see that the person messaged me saying, "You've got a soft spot for the little ones, I see. I'll keep that in mind." I wrote back saying, "No kids." They replied, "Of course, whatever you want, Travis. You're the man. Now I know you've had a long night, but do you have time for one more?" I wrote back, "Sure, just one." They sent an address to a house not far from the neighborhood where my parents lived. I parked on the street a couple blocks down when I arrived. I walked down the street to the house. There was a familiar-looking man taking out his trash to the can on the side of his house. I snuck up behind him and put him in a chokehold until he passed out. I shined my phone light on his face. It was Mr. Romero. I quickly picked him up on my shoulders and threw him into the trunk of the SUV. I drove back to the storage unit and parked inside. I sent a message to the unknown number saying, "I want to spend some time on this one. I want to make him scream. Do you have any quiet places I can take him to?" They replied, "Thought you'd never ask. You know where the Wolf Hotel is?" I replied saying yes. They wrote back, "The entire bottom floor is ours. It's below the basement. There's too many fuses and power systems in the basement for anyone to hear anything. But once you get to our floor, it's dead silent. Just one condition if you're wanting to torture." I replied saying, "Sure." They wrote back, "If you use one of our torture rooms, you are going to be recorded. Snuff sites make fortunes you wouldn't believe. and if you do a good job, we can throw you a bonus. I replied with the letter K. Romero was finally mine. I was certain that I would want to revisit the moment of making him feel the suffering and humiliation that he caused so many. Recording his death was a win-win. I took some of my dad's old handcuffs and kept them on me for a case like this. I cuffed Mr. Romero and tied a plastic sack over his head. I opened up the storage unit and made my way toward the Wolf Hotel. There were quite a bit of cars in the parking lot. I drove around the building and parked in the corner where no other cars really were. I noticed a police car parked with its lights on in one of the other corners. I messaged the unknown number saying, "There's a pig parked near me, has his lights on. What should I do?" They instantly wrote back saying, "We'll take care of it. Just sit tight and he'll get a call." I waited for a few minutes watching the police car. It then drove off with its red and blue lights turned on. I figured the station was already suspicious of the hotel. Thank God the officer got a call. It made me wonder what they did. The number sent me a message on what to do. "Alright, make this quick and quiet and you won't get caught. Get out of the car and go grab one of the trash carts by the dumpsters. Throw the man into the cart and cover him up with the ruined linen. Walk inside the hotel from the back door that we unlocked and step into the elevator. We will program it to send you to the basement." I wrote back asking them, "How certain are you that I won't get caught?" They replied saying, "We know the owner. Well, the owner knows us. She knows what we can do. I'll explain later, but get a move on right now and keep that mask on." Right as I read that message, I stepped out and went to grab the trash cart with a couple sheets by the dumpster. I pushed the cart to the car and opened the trunk. Mr. Romero was slightly waking up as I tried to pull him into the cart. I pulled out the Glock and struck him on the head with the bottom of the grip to keep him asleep. I pulled him into the trash cart and threw the dirty sheets over him. It looked convincing enough to me, besides the fact that I was wearing my face. I closed the trunk door and locked my car. I pushed the trash cart up to the back door, as commanded, and walked inside. The hotel looked like it had no maintenance done on it whatsoever, and no one was around. I saw on the clock in the elevator that it was a little over 2:30 in the morning. I had some time, but not a lot. The elevator door closed and started going downward without me even pressing a button. The doors opened up to a dark hallway with concrete walls. At the end of the hallway was a rusty metal gate. I pushed the cart down the hallway until I got to the gate. I pulled out my phone and checked for a message. There was a message from a number saying, "Look up into the camera and hold up 3 fingers, then make a fist." I looked up to see a surveillance camera in the right corner of the ceiling above the gate. I held up 3 fingers, then made a fist as told. The gate then opened up. I pushed the car through the gate entrance into the next room. Excitement rushed through my blood as I looked around to see all the traps and tools in the large, quiet room. It was like a playground. I threw the trash cart upward, causing Mr. Romero to stumble out onto the hard, rusty floor. I looked around at all the traps and the weapons displayed on the walls. I saw one that looked much like the one in the video I was sent by the unknown number. It gave me quite an idea. There was also a chair with straps. I didn't know where to start or what to do. There were so many options. I hatched an idea when I saw multiple hooks on chains hanging from the ceiling. I took the plastic sack off of Romero's head. He was still out cold. I grabbed his arm and dragged him over to where the hooks were. I raised his right arm up and pulled down one of the hooks. I penetrated both of his hands onto the meat hook. Blood was pouring from his hands and leaking down his arm onto his face. He started waking up. I walked over to the machinery where the chains were linked and pressed the button with the upward arrow on it. The chain started rotating in the machine, and the hooks raised up, with Romero hanging on one of them by his hands. I could hear him wake up while I took a large sledgehammer off of the wall. I turned around and slowly walked up to the hanging, petrified Mr. Romero.
I have a wife and kids. Please, just talk to me. I'll pay you. Just take off the mask and let's talk,
he said in a trembling voice. I raised the sledgehammer up and pointed at the hook piercing his two hands. Does that hurt? I asked him.
Yes, it fucking burns. Just stop this,
he cried out. That was when I dropped the sledgehammer, grabbed both his shins, and pulled him off of the hook. His hands splitting and fingers falling to the ground. His primal screams were epic. I picked up the sledgehammer and crushed both of Romero's feet. With both his hands and feet destroyed, he was incapable of escaping. I walked over to the wall and set the sledgehammer back where it was. I then grabbed what looked to be a large scalpel. I approached Romero and rolled him over on his stomach. I pulled up his t-shirt and used the scalpel to cut off a line of skin down his back. He shrieked long and loud as I continually scraped down his back with the razor-sharp scalpel. I proceeded until there was no skin in his back and his ribcage was showing. There was a large puddle of blood where he laid. I went over to a silver dissection table that had a container of sulfuric acid underneath it. I took that acid container and took off the lid while slowly walking over to the skinned Mr. Romero. I poured the acid on his skinless back. The acid sizzled while Romero let out a primal howl of torment. I rolled him onto his back and poured the rest of sulfuric acid onto him. I pulled out a Zippo lighter from my jacket and set flame to the flammable acid. My entire body was stimulated by the sight of Mr. Romero burning alive and screaming even louder and hoarser. It wasn't over yet. There was a gallon of water under the silver table as well. I extinguished the flames on Mr. Romero. He barely survived. His carried-out whimpers were meant to be screams. His clothes were charred black and skin cooked like raw meat. His hair was burnt off, and you could see the outline of his bones. He still had both of his eyes. I kneeled down below him and took off my mask. He looked up at me and used all his effort to speak the words.
Travis, why would you?
Before he could finish, I rapidly struck his head with my fists. I kept punching his head over and over, the room getting darker and my vision getting blurrier until I blacked out. I woke up on the floor of the large torture room. I pulled out my phone to see that it was 4:17 in the morning. There was a message from the unknown number telling me that I should head home as soon as I woke up. I looked over at Mr. Romero. There was nothing left. Just blood, flesh, and bone scattered all over the floor. He was completely destroyed. My mask was on the concrete floor and stained with blood. I picked it up and put it in my jacket. I left the room as it was. I came out of the elevator on the first floor of the Wolf Hotel and walked out the back door. I walked over to where I parked the SUV, but it was replaced by my own truck. I guess they swapped them out to save me the trip. It was convenient considering I had a long night. I drove from the Wolf Hotel to a gas station close to my house. I bought a large water bottle as I was dehydrated after a long, violent night. I finally made it back home. I got back into my room and hung up my jacket in the closet and placed the mask in the bottom drawer of my desk. I walked out into the hallway in hopes that my parents were still asleep. As I entered the kitchen from the hallway, I could see that my mom was on her laptop at the dining room table.
Where were you?
She asked. I let out a long sigh. I just went to the park, I said.
At 4 o'clock in the morning?
She asked with a tone. I took a deep breath before replying. Mom, I tried to kill myself and I woke up. I woke up. I still have to live like this. I still have to go to a job that I fucking hate and live in a town where everyone treats me like a freak. You have to let me adjust. You have to let me drive to the park at 3 in the morning to get some fresh air from the bullshit. You just have to let me, okay? There was the longest pause. I was expecting a 10-minute lecture with a raise in volume. But no, she just softly said, okay. I couldn't believe it. I actually expressed emotion without being quote-unquote too emotional. I put my water bottle in the refrigerator to finish later. I went back into my room and went to bed. After that night, things were much different. I had a routine, a side gig. I was a killer. I am a killer. There's no better way to summarize it. Throughout the rest of that winter and into the spring, I had killed a variety of people. Some I can speak of, some I cannot. The unknown number always guided me, though I never did uncover who it was. At the end of May that year, I planned to make one more attack on that town for good. It was time to get what I really wanted. I packed up the SUV with everything I needed, as I would not return. There was a graduation ceremony for all the students in my grade. I sent a text message to my old friend Brandon, telling him not to show up. It was a warm afternoon at the football field. Everyone was there, parents, teachers, friends, so many people. They were all so happy. Everyone cheered as each student made their own speeches. I waited, watching, listening. Finally, Hannah Ross went up to the podium to make her speech. I walked out from under the bleachers. I saw her, and she saw me. Somehow, I felt she knew who I was behind my mask. I walked past the podium and right up to the portable bleachers that all the graduates were standing on. They all trembled. I raised up my AK-47 and gave my regards. So many caps and gowns and diplomas sprayed with lead. I left no survivors except for her. The whole audience screamed, police sirens howling in the distance already. Hannah Ross got up from the grass. She looked around at all her dead classmates. She couldn't even make a noise. Her angelic, soft face was frozen. She turned around and looked at me with her piercing, baby blue eyes, both bloodshot and tearful. She didn't say a word to me, and I didn't say a word to her. But we both knew that she broke me, and I broke her. I turned around and walked away. I ran back to the black SUV parked behind a dumpster. I took off and switched the lever, activating my red and blue police lights to blend in with the others patrolling the campus. I took the first exit I could onto the interstate and left that place for good. I was going about 75 miles an hour down the interstate with my police lights on for about 20 minutes before I shut the lights off and slowed down. I was certain to be long gone by then. I pulled into a rest stop in a large forest. I parked the car and stepped out. I walked deep into the forest out of sight. I was getting hungry. I wondered what was next. I sat down on a log and took my mask off. I scratched my head. I kept scratching and scratching until I pulled my hair out of my head, blood running down the back of my head. I grabbed the back of my right ear and ripped it downward, taking off a large chunk of skin from the right side of my face. The pain was exquisite. It was orgasmic. I needed more. I ran to the fence near the entrance of where I parked. I grabbed the barbed wire from the top of the fence and ripped it off. I ran into the forest and threw off my jacket. I wrapped the barbed wire around me until it was skin tight. I shaked and squirmed, the barbed wire slicing and cutting into me all around. It still wasn't enough. I pressed my limbs as hard as I could against the wire to maximize the pain, but I pressed too hard and snapped the wire, releasing me. I got up on my knees, my blood bursting through the open wounds all over me, head to toe. I looked up into the moon and took a deep breath before letting out a howl from the bottom of my dark red soul. Out of nowhere, a beam of a flashlight shined on me, and a loud voice shouted, "Hands in the air! Put him up!" I was nearly blinded by multiple flashlight beams in all directions behind the trees. Multiple SWAT agents surrounded me at gunpoint. There were at least 10 of them. 2 officers lowered their guns and walked up to search me. I growled furiously. The 2 officers then backed away from me, and the one that first shone his light on me walked up to me and lowered it, revealing him to be Officer Stokes. He glared into my eyes before he ever so softly spoke. "My son graduated today. His name was Jordan Stokes. Maybe you knew him, maybe you didn't. He loved basketball. He got a scholarship to play at state. It's what he always wanted." Officer Stokes then pulled out his baton. "You must think that you drove far enough where no one will catch you. No one will see you. You did. No one's gonna know what happened to you. No one's gonna see this." He raised his baton and swung it down right onto my head, knocking me unconscious. I woke up in a bright room, handcuffed to a table. The room was small. The walls were all white. There was a dark black window to my left that I couldn't see through. I saw my reflection in the glass. There wasn't a scratch on me, my face, my arms. Everything was perfectly fine. I began to think that it was only a dream, but it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. The door on the other side of the room across from me opened up, and a man in a gray striped suit walked in with 2 armored guards with guns behind him. The man in the suit was carrying a black briefcase that he set down on the table across from me and took a seat. "Travis Jones, I'm Dr. Wilbanks. Do you understand what you've done?" said the man in the suit. "I killed people," I replied. "That you did, Mr. Jones, and not just a few. You killed 62 people in under a year. For a kid your age, that's unbelievable. You see, the whole state wants you to serve life without parole, but I can offer you something better. I can have you out in the world walking free. How's that sound?" said Dr. Wilbanks. "Out in the world so I can kill more people? Sure, I'll take your offer," I said to him. "You know, I was hoping you'd say that. The crazier you act, the better," he replied to me with a smile. "I'm not like anyone you've ever dealt with. No matter what happens to me, all I will do is slaughter," I stated with a growl. "Oh, believe me, I've seen plenty just like you, kid. We're everywhere," said the doctor. "We'll see about that when I paused mid-sentence when I came to the realization Wait, why did you say we? You said we're everywhere. Why did you say that? Dr. Wilbanks turned around and nodded his head at the two armored guards. The guard on the right took off his helmet. His face was completely mutilated. The skin around his mouth was torn off and his nose was missing. The other guard on the left took off his helmet, and his face was even worse. There was no skin left. He was just a red skeleton. Dr. Wilbanks then turned back around to face me, and then grabbed his jaw with both of his hands. He gently pulled on his jaw until 2 snaps were heard. He then detached the entire layer of skin from his lower jaw all the way down his neck. You could see everything, his whole tongue, his throat, his pulsating veins. Some kind of sticky glass substance was keeping it all together. Dr. Wilbanks reattached his jaw and neck, then continued talking.
We can do anything. You can start fresh. We already fixed your face. We've been watching you this whole time, observing you, observing everything. We grow stronger by the minute. There's people just like you all over. If you produce for us, we can offer you anything. Kill whoever you want, fuck whoever you want. Our production is a war on morality, a war on God. What do you say, Travis? He opened up the black briefcase, revealing its contents to be my Bowie knife and my mask before finishing his question. Are you in? I took a deep breath and gave my answer. I'm in. Over the years, I've been desperate to fulfill my desire for blood, but still haven't. Each time I slaughter, I grow hungrier for more blood, more suffering. I didn't cure my anhedonia by killing all those people. I made it worse. As I'm writing this, I've murdered over 200 people. Not a single one fulfilling me, but rather starving me for the next. I live with the burdens of Anhedonia and the weight of all the innocent lives I have taken. Dr. Wilbanks was right. There's people like me all over. So my purpose of writing this is to advise anyone out there who feels how I felt. Before you attack your jerk teacher from school or your asshole boss at work, before you throw that girl in the back of your car, before you walk into that school with a loaded gun, I'm telling you right now, it's not worth it.